There is a profound difference between ordinary manipulation and calculated psychological warfare. In the earlier stages of narcissistic behavior, manipulation often looks chaotic. It feels reactive. It may involve gaslighting, guilt tripping, blame shifting, or playing the victim. It is unhealthy, yes, but it is often driven by insecurity, fragility, or a desperate need for validation. However, when the narcissist shifts into something darker, the entire tone changes. The manipulation becomes intentional, strategic, measured, and that is when it becomes truly terrifying. You begin to notice that nothing is random anymore. Conversations feel staged. Conflicts feel orchestrated. Emotional explosions seem timed. Instead of impulsive reactions, there is planning. Instead of defensive denial, there is calculated distortion. They are no longer scrambling to protect their ego. They are constructing an environment where you are systematically destabilized. This is where the dynamic transforms from dysfunction into domination. They begin gathering information about you in ways that no longer feel intimate but investigative. Your fears, your insecurities, your childhood wounds, your professional vulnerabilities. These are not held with care. They are stored, filed away, studied, filed away, studied, and when the moment serves them, those very tender parts of you are weaponized. You may notice that they provoke you deliberately. They will push emotional buttons they know are sensitive. They will create confusion and then watch your reaction carefully. And sometimes this is where it becomes chilling. They may even document it. Screenshots, recordings, selective retellings to others. They create a narrative in advance so that if you ever defend yourself, you already look unstable. That is not insecurity. That is strategy. Another sign of this shift is how they isolate you. Not loudly, not dramatically, but subtly. They plant doubts in the minds of others. They question your reliability. They suggest you are going through something. They frame themselves as concerned while quietly eroding your credibility. By the time you realize what is happening, you may already feel alone, and the loneliness is not accidental. It is engineered. What makes this stage especially frightening is the emotional temperature. Earlier manipulation may have been loud, chaotic, filled with tears or rage. But strategic psychological warfare is cold. There is a calmness to it, a stillness. They do not need to shout. They do not need to over-explain. They simply move pieces quietly. You start to feel like you are in a game you did not agree to play. You may sense that they are thinking 3 steps ahead. When you confront them, they already have a counter-argument prepared. When you set a boundary, they already anticipated it and built a workaround. When you attempt to leave, they may unleash a sequence of events designed to destabilize you financially, socially, or emotionally. It feels orchestrated because it is. And perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects is the absence of remorse. In earlier phases, there may have been moments, even brief ones, where they appeared apologetic or ashamed. But at this stage, there is a shift. The harm is not accidental collateral damage. It is purposeful. And they seem emotionally detached from the consequences. You may find yourself questioning whether they are even aware of what they are doing. And the uncomfortable truth is, they likely are. That awareness is what differentiates chaos from cruelty. When manipulation becomes warfare, the goal is no longer admiration. It is control. Total control over your perception, your emotions, your relationships, your sense of stability. They want you unsure. They want you second guessing. They want you preoccupied with managing their reactions so that you have no energy left to examine the larger pattern. Over time, your world shrinks. You become hyper-focused on not triggering them. You rehearse conversations before having them. You edit yourself constantly. And while you are exhausting yourself trying to keep the peace, they are observing the impact of their strategies. This is why this stage feels so destabilizing. It is not just emotional volatility, it is systematic erosion. And the most dangerous part is how slowly it can unfold. There may not be one explosive event that alerts you. Instead, it is a gradual tightening, a slow narrowing of options, a quiet undermining of your confidence. You wake up one day and realize you do not recognize yourself. You are more anxious, more doubtful, more isolated. That realization is often the first moment clarity begins to break through. Because once you see that the behavior is strategic rather than accidental, something shifts in you. You stop personalizing every attack. You begin recognizing patterns instead of incidents, and that awareness is powerful. When manipulation becomes calculated psychological warfare, it is terrifying not because it is loud, but because it is deliberate. And recognizing that deliberateness is the first step toward reclaiming your clarity, your autonomy, and your safety. One of the most chilling shifts you will ever witness is when empathy disappears completely, not fades, not weakens. Disappears. In earlier stages of narcissistic behavior, there may have been flashes of concern, moments where they appeared supportive, affectionate, or even protective, but those moments were often conditional. Transactional. They cared when it made them look good. They cared when it benefited them. They cared when your well-being aligned with their image. Yet when a narcissistic personality turns darker, even that performative empathy begins to evaporate. You start to notice something unsettling. Your pain no longer registers. Or worse, it registers and it seems to irritate them. You might be overwhelmed with work, grieving a loss, struggling with your health, or navigating a crisis. Instead of comfort, you receive impatience. Instead of reassurance, you get criticism. Instead of support, you get silence, and sometimes even subtle mockery, a sigh, an eye roll, a comment that minimizes your experience. It is not just indifference. It feels colder than that. Empathy is the emotional bridge that allows one human being to feel the reality of another. When that bridge collapses entirely, you are no longer interacting with someone who can emotionally resonate with you. You are interacting with someone who sees your vulnerability as either irrelevant or exploitable. That is what makes this stage so deeply destabilizing. You may begin to test it unconsciously. You might share something painful just to see if they respond differently this time. You might wait for a moment of softness, but instead, you are met with deflection, blame, or even escalation. They may redirect the conversation to themselves. They may accuse you of being dramatic. They may suggest that your suffering is an inconvenience to them. And in some cases, there is something even more disturbing, a subtle satisfaction. When empathy fully erodes, cruelty becomes easier. There is no internal emotional barrier preventing them from going too far. They do not feel the discomfort that most people would feel when witnessing someone they claim to care about in distress. Without that internal break, their behavior can escalate without hesitation. You might notice they become harsher during your weakest moments. If you are sick, they may pick fights. If you are grieving, they may withdraw affection. If you are anxious, they may amplify uncertainty. It can begin to feel as though your vulnerability triggers something predatory rather than protective. This is a profound red flag. A healthy person may not always know what to say, but they feel something when you hurt. There is visible discomfort, concern, a desire to reduce your suffering. Even flawed people carry some emotional responsiveness, but when empathy disappears entirely, there is a void, a flatness, a chilling neutrality. They can look at you while you cry and feel nothing. And over time, this absence begins to affect you in ways you may not immediately recognize. You may stop sharing your struggles because you have learned there will be no comfort. You may suppress your emotions to avoid criticism. You may begin handling everything alone, even when you are overwhelmed. This emotional isolation is dangerous because it conditions you to believe your needs are excessive, but they are not. Another sign of empathy collapse is the rewriting of your emotional experiences. If you express hurt, they frame it as weakness. If you set a boundary, they frame it as aggression. If you ask for accountability, they frame it as cruelty toward them. They invert reality so thoroughly that you begin questioning whether your pain is legitimate. Without empathy in the equation, your feelings are not treated as valid data. They are treated as obstacles. And here is the deeper layer. When empathy vanishes, connection becomes impossible. Relationships require emotional reciprocity. They require the ability to step outside oneself and recognize another person's internal world. When that ability is gone, the relationship transforms into a power structure. You exist, I. The dynamic not as a partner, but as a resource, a regulator, a mirror, a target. This is why many people describe this stage as feeling like they are living with a stranger. The warmth that once existed, even if inconsistent, is gone. The humanity feels stripped away. Conversations become transactional. Affection becomes conditional, and compassion feels extinct. It is important to understand that this is not something you can fix. You cannot love someone into empathy. You cannot explain your pain in a way that will awaken something that has been deliberately suppressed or fundamentally absent. The moment you recognize that your suffering does not move them, not even slightly, you are facing a critical truth. Because a person who cannot feel your pain has no internal mechanism stopping them from causing more of it. And that awareness, though painful, is clarifying. When empathy disappears completely, what remains is control, image management, and self-interest. The relationship ceases to be emotional and becomes strategic. And once you see that shift clearly, you begin to understand that what you are dealing with is no longer simply narcissism. It is something far colder, far more detached, and far more dangerous to your psychological well-being. There is a moment in these dynamics when conflict stops being about discipline and starts becoming about discipline. That is when you know something has shifted into dangerous territory. In healthier relationships, even unhealthy ones, arguments are messy but finite. There is tension, discussion, sometimes raised voices, and eventually some form of resolution or at least pause. But when punishment replaces conflict, you are no longer dealing with disagreement. You are dealing with enforcement. You begin to notice that every act of independence carries a consequence. You set a boundary, they withdraw effect time on for days. You question an inconsistency. They explode or disappear. You succeed at something without them. They undermine or belittle you. You express hurt. They escalate it. The message becomes clear. Compliance equals peace. Autonomy equals pain. This is not accidental behavior. It is conditioning. Punishment in this context is rarely proportionate. In fact, its intensity is the point. The reaction is designed to be so uncomfortable that you think twice before ever challenging them again. A simple disagreement may result in a week-long silent treatment. A minor critique may lead to public humiliation. A request for accountability may trigger financial sabotage, emotional abandonment, or the sudden resurfacing of old grievances meant to overwhelm you. You start to feel like you are being trained. The silent treatment, for example, is not merely distance. It is a psychological tactic. When someone abruptly cuts off communication without explanation, your nervous system goes into distress. Humans are wired for connection. Sudden withdrawal activates anxiety, fear, and self-doubt. You replay conversations in your head. You wonder what you did wrong. You begin negotiating internally just to restore peace. And when they finally return, it often comes with an unspoken rule. Do not cross me again. Over time, this creates a state of hypervigilance. You become extremely aware of tone, timing, and wording. You calculate the safest way to bring up topics. You avoid certain conversations altogether. You shrink parts of yourself to reduce risk. You trade authenticity for safety. That is the real objective. Punishment as a pattern is about power. It shifts the dynamic from partnership to hierarchy. They become the authority figure deciding what is acceptable, while you unconsciously adopt the role of someone seeking approval or avoiding penalty. And perhaps one of the most insidious aspects of this stage is unpredictability. Sometimes the punishment is immediate. Other times it is delayed. You might think a conflict has passed, only for it to resurface weeks later in a completely different form. They may store perceived slights and unleash them strategically when you are already vulnerable. This unpredictability keeps you off balance. You may also notice escalation. What once triggered mild irritation now triggers severe retaliation. The stakes rise, the reactions intensify. The emotional cost of dissent grows heavier. It begins to feel unsafe to have needs. In some cases, punishment goes beyond emotional withdrawal. It can include smear campaigns where they quietly damage your reputation. They may share private information under the guise of concern. They may twist stories to paint you as unstable or abusive. This creates a secondary layer of punishment, social isolation. The goal is to ensure that resistance feels too expensive. And here is what makes this especially dangerous. You may start blaming yourself. Because if every conflict results in severe consequences, it is tempting to conclude that you are the problem. You might think, if I were more patient, more understanding, less sensitive, this wouldn't happen. But that is part of the conditioning. The punishment is designed to redirect accountability away from them and onto you. Over time, you adapt. You become quieter, more agreeable, less expressive. You may even convince yourself that keeping the peace is maturity, but deep down, your body knows the truth. There is tension in your shoulders, tightness in your chest, a constant scanning for the next trigger. That is not a relationship. That is survival. When punishment replaces conflict, communication dies. There is no space for honest dialogue because honesty carries risk. There is no room for growth because growth requires vulnerability. Instead, there is enforcement, control, and fear-based compliance. And fear, once embedded in a relationship, changes everything. You begin to measure your words not by truth, but by safety. You prioritize avoiding backlash over expressing your needs. You may even preemptively criticize yourself just to soften their reaction. The dynamic becomes a system where your role is to prevent explosions rather than build connection. This is the moment where the shift into something darker becomes undeniable, because healthy conflict seeks resolution. Narcissistic conflict seeks victory. but punitive conflict seeks submission. And submission is the ultimate goal. Recognizing this pattern is painful because it forces you to confront a difficult truth. The relationship is no longer about mutual understanding. It is about control. And once control becomes the central operating principle, the emotional environment becomes unsafe. Punishment as a response to independence is not love. It is dominance. And no relationship built on dominance can ever provide stability, respect, or genuine intimacy. When reality itself becomes unstable, you are no longer just in a toxic relationship. You are in psychological quicksand. In earlier stages of narcissistic dynamics, there may have been denial, defensiveness, or occasional gaslighting. They might minimize events, shift blame, or conveniently forget what was said. But when things turn darker, the distortion of reality becomes bold, relentless, and limitless. It is no longer about escaping accountability in a single moment. It becomes an entire strategy built around rewriting the narrative of your life. You begin to notice that facts no longer matter. You can show proof, messages, timelines, clear memories, and it makes no difference. They will look at evidence and calmly deny it, or they will twist it so thoroughly that the original truth becomes unrecognizable. They speak with such certainty that it destabilizes you. There is no hesitation in their voice, no flicker of doubt in their eyes, just unwavering conviction. And that conviction is what makes it so dangerous. Because humans rely on shared reality to feel safe. When two people can agree on what happened, even if they disagree on interpretation, there is stability. But when someone refuses to acknowledge objective events, you begin to question your own mind. You replay conversations repeatedly. You wonder if you misunderstood. You search your memory for gaps. The rewriting can become expansive. They do not just deny isolated incidents, they reconstruct entire histories. Past arguments are reframed to make you the aggressor. Their betrayals are reframed as your paranoia. Your reactions to mistreatment are labeled as abuse. They invert roles so completely that you start defending yourself against things you did not do. This is not confusion. It is calculated destabilization, and often they do not stop at private distortion. They export their version of reality to others. Friends, family members, co-workers, they subtly plant narratives. They present themselves as misunderstood, long-suffering, or concerned. They may describe you as volatile, unstable, overly sensitive, and because they deliver these narratives calmly and confidently, people may leave them. This is how smear campaigns begin. What makes this especially frightening is the isolation that follows. You may reach out for support only to sense hesitation in others. You may try to explain your experience, but it sounds defensive. You feel like you are trying to prove something that should be obvious. And slowly you begin to withdraw. When reality is rewritten around you, you feel alone in your version of events. The psychological toll of this is profound. Self-trust begins to erode. You second-guess not only what happened, but how you felt about what happened. You may start asking yourself whether you are too sensitive, whether you misinterpreted tone, whether you imagined patterns. This internal doubt is exactly what sustains their power. Because when you no longer trust your perception, you rely on theirs. And that reliance creates dependency, believing extreme cases, the distortion becomes theatrical. They may perform innocence publicly while privately escalating harm. They may express shock at accusations they know are valid. They may accuse you of the very behaviors they are engaging in. This projection serves two purposes. It confuses you, and it preemptively discredits you. If you attempt to speak out, it appears as though you are mirroring their claims. Over time, living inside this rewritten reality becomes exhausting. You feel like you are constantly defending basic facts. Conversations feel circular. No resolution is ever reached because the foundation itself is unstable. You cannot solve problems when the existence of the problem is denied. And yet, there is something even more unsettling: the ease with which they do it. They do not appear distressed by the contradiction. They do not struggle to maintain the alternate narrative. They shift stories fluidly. They adjust details seamlessly. It is as though truth is flexible and the constant is their self-protection. That emotional detachment from truth signals a deeper issue. Most people feel some discomfort when lying, especially about significant events. There is anxiety, hesitation, guilt. But when those internal signals are absent, distortion becomes effortless. You begin to feel like you are standing on shifting ground. Every conversation could be reinterpreted. Every memory could be challenged. You may even start documenting interactions just to reassure yourself that you are not imagining things. That instinct to document is not paranoia. It is self-preservation. When someone rewrites reality without limits, they are not just avoiding accountability. They are reshaping your psychological environment. They are attempting to control not only how others see you, but how you see yourself. And once someone attempts to control your perception of reality, the dynamic has moved into profoundly unsafe territory. Because without a stable sense of what is real, you cannot anchor yourself. And without that anchor, you become easier to manipulate, easier to intimidate, easier to silence. Recognizing this pattern is powerful. The moment you see that the distortion is deliberate rather than accidental, you begin reclaiming your footing. You stop arguing facts with someone committed to fiction. You start grounding yourself in evidence, in trusted support systems, in your own consistent memory. When reality is rewritten with no limits, the damage is psychological. But awareness is stabilizing. And stabilizing yourself is the first act of reclaiming your power.